actually here in India on holidays. We're having a holiday in India and calling into Ecrasat to say good day to Anne and I. With Siggy Gartman at the back here and Hugh Alexander over to the left. Having a holiday, but I made them come and I asked them to give a seminar because they're both very prominent people in agriculture in Australia. So Harm van Ries is a consultant agronomist. He has private clients, so farmers pay for his service to help in the agronomic management. He also runs research trials. He's been a research agronomist for most of his career. Alex is the CEO of an organisation called the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal. She'll tell you more about that foundation, but it's basically a community-run organisation. And she's been before that she was the CEO of this farmer group in Australia called the Virtual Cropping Group that Harm's been involved in. So that's where I got to know them both, through this proactive farmer group that attracted researchers to come in and work with them on issues that were important to the farmers. So it's a very well-known farmer group in Australia. So Alex was the CEO of that for many years, 10 years, and Harm helped establish this farmer group and took it to a level of prominence in Australia. So a very interesting model for doing research. Alex, as I said, has moved on to this foundation, and just recently she's left there and she's now become the managing director and CEO of one of Australia's banks, Rural Bank. So Alex has gone off to banking. I don't know what that means and what she's going to do. But anyway, they're here. I've invited them to both come and talk about their work in Australia and its relevance to Ecrasat's mandate. I think Harm's going first, so I think I think there's about 15 minutes presentation, and then we'll have some questions, and then Alex will do the same thing. So please welcome my two special friends for this presentation.
Very much for the invitation as well. It's I was in India 20 years ago with the same group of farmers that I'm going to be talking about now. We were on a trade mission looking at pulses in India, and in the last 20 years we've all seen changes around the world in the way that countries have developed. But I must say India looks nothing like it did 20 years ago. It's been phenomenal, the development that has taken place. I'm not sure that your roads are a lot better than they were 20 years ago in terms of the traffic, but certainly in terms of development and people, where they're living and how they're living, has been a big change. So I just want to give a brief introduction to some of the things that you're also dealing with, and that's the primary one in the area that I'm working in is climate variability. There's a huge change from year to year in our climate, which means that farmers have to react to that. And I want to try and link in how do the research organisations in Australia actually deal with that, because it's a very different way of farming compared to where you're having a very stable climate, or you have an irrigation system. So I'm going to talk about farming in the Mallee. The Mallee is a very large area in southeastern Australia with low rainfall, high risk, and talk about the financial performance of farmers as well, and what is what the future will look like for them. So very, very briefly, yes. So very briefly, the area in the Mallee. This is the Mallee in South Australia as well as in Victoria. Annual rainfall is between 300 and 400 millimetres. We've got very hot and dry summers, so we don't grow our crops over the summer period. We grow our crops in the winter period, which is very different to most other dryland areas around the world. This is what it looks like once every 10 years. This photo was taken in 2006. So we have shocking droughts where we might only get a quarter of the annual rainfall. But then again, we also have these kind of years which are spectacular years for us. And you'll probably understand that the income that farmers earn, in the first slide that I showed, there is no income. Farmers make very large losses, and then in a year like this, they make very high profits. So the Mallee land system is it's fairly flat. There's it's a dune system, a dune and a swell system. Up in the rises, we've got deep sandy soils with a plain available water holding capacity of about 120 millimetres. And then on the flatter parts of the landscape, we've got high chloride, so we've got sodium chloride in the profile, as well as boron, and the plain available water holding capacity is only 80 millimetres. And that is a very critical difference because we are very dependent on stored water to be able to grow a crop. These are our main produce, which is very similar to many crops that you grow, so wheat and barley. We grow these pulses as well as vetch. We do grow canola, and wool and meat are also important for many farmers. This is just a brief outline of our weather or rainfall conditions, and you can see there are some, there's many severe droughts that are occurring, but we also have good years. And if you relate that to yields, the yields can go from nearly zero in 1982 to about 2.5 tonnes to the hectare. So that's the regional yields in that area. So it's a very difficult climate for farmers to work in. And this is probably, and I'm sure most of you have seen this really vicious cycle of uncertainty and how farmers deal with it. We've given the climate we're working in low, unreliable rainfall, which means we've got unreliable yield and profit. You saw that in my previous slide. Which means it's a high-risk farming system, which means farmers naturally go for a low input system, which further exacerbates the problem with low and unreliable yields. Because farmers are not sure about what inputs they should be putting in to take the best advantage of the good years. So can we look at a risk management strategy that actually reduces or breaks this cycle so that farmers can be more assured of making very high profits in the good years, which offsets the losses in the bad years? Just a quick, this is exactly the same field in 2006 in October, and 4 years later, that's what the crop looked like. So extreme differences between years. I want to give you an example of a typical farm that I work on in the Mallee, and Anthony Whitbread sitting in the back there, he comes from this area, so he's very familiar with this farming system. And actually where this photo is taken from is only about 30 or 40 kilometres away from where Anthony actually grew up in the Mallee. So as you appreciate, farms are very large in Australia, especially in this climatic zone. This farm is 5,200 hectares, 4,002 hectares in crop, and 1,000 hectares is for sheep. And it's a no-till farm, so it's a conservation agriculture farm. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a dramatic change in the way that people farm, and the biggest change has come through engineering. Agricultural engineering has really driven agricultural innovation in farming in Australia. So everything is sown and sprayed with chemicals on GPS, so we've got auto steer, farmers don't steer the tractor anymore, everything is done by a computerized system. We've got very large machinery, we've got efficient delivery of grain, we're using shorter and longer term forecasting periods for the climate and for the weather. We've got a lot of new herbicides on the markets, as well as herbicide tolerant crops, and that includes GM canola, ready Roundup canola. We retain nearly all of our stubbles in a no-till system. We've got many new cultivars on the market with resistance to diseases. And the most important part is that we're using CSIRO developed modelling technology in helping our farmers make better decisions. And I'll talk about that program a little bit more. Now just briefly to show you the extremes in farm profitability. So this is farm profit and loss in dollars. So anything above the line is profit, and anything below the line is in red, which are the losses. So you can see that in some years, this farm makes significant profits. We're looking at somewhere around $5 million in profits. But we're also making huge losses in some years. And that is primarily driven because of the cost of production. So, sorry, not 5 million, 500,000 and 700,000 in loss in that particular year, and And it's really driven by rainfall. So this blue line is the growing season rainfall, the rainfall we get during the cropping season. And this is the millennium drought period in which many farmers suffered significantly in Australia because of the 2000 drought. So when we're talking about a modelling exercise, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with APSIM, but APSIM is basically modelling the whole of the cropping cycle, right from the beginning or even pre-crop, before sowing, and every single component is modelled. And I don't want to really go into the depth of that because we've got people here like Peter and Anthony who develop much of APSIM and they can do a much better job. But how is APSIM actually being used is what I'd like to talk about. So we call it yield profit, which is where we've linked the APSIM technology to what the farmer does. So the farmer is not actually using APSIM himself. He's not opening the APSIM program. He's actually using a platform that we developed with the Virtual Cropping Group together with CSIRO so that farmers can actually use the outputs of APSIM. And this is a very nice photo of the same farmer from that he put his desk. So this is actually a real photo. He put his desk out in the paddock, put his very old computer on the desk, and during harvest in the background, and basically showing that this farmer is using the latest technology, not only out in the field, but also in the office. So, and we're really looking at risk assessment. You know, what's the optimum time of sowing? What's the optimum in inputs? How do we deal with frost and heat shock? And what can we do about managing the rainfall that we got and the forecast and ensuring that we have a stable yield? So the user, farmer consultant, connected via a website, which is connected to several databases, soil databases, as well as weather, and which all goes through a run machine, and then APSIM is running in CSIRO as a cluster. So the farmer puts in their details for their paddocks, their fields on the farm, and puts in the data, asks for a report, and that then comes back about 10 minutes later back to the farmer. And I'll show you some of those outputs. And basically, yield profit uses all the crop details on the farm. It's got all the fertilizer inputs. It's got the paddock rainfall data. It's got the soil classification, and plant available water holding capacity is essential to this because we are so dependent on stored water. And it's linked to the soil testing, to the nitrate, ammonium, chloride levels in the soil, and short-term and long-term climate and weather data. So the way that we're operating the system is that the farmer sows their crop, and from the date of soil sampling, APSIM starts to undertake the modelling. So it takes the weather information, the rainfall information, what we started with, how much nitrate was in the soil, and then the model starts and it's calculating out mineralization and all the other components. As soon as you sow the crop, you start using water, and then the farmer can run reports from any time onwards. And for example, this report was run at the end of June or July, and then the model uses historical data from this point to harvest over a 100-year period. So we start getting a probability of likely outcome. So every year from this point onwards, we're using historical rainfall from July until October, which is harvest time. And for example, in 1916, the simulated yield for that paddock would have been 7.4 tonnes. But in 1926, using the weather from that year, it was only 2.9 tonnes. So you can see we can get 100 years of likely outcomes, and that is presented as a probability curve. So on this is the probabilities part, and this is the yield. And the actual yield, or the simulated yield, with the amount of nitrogen on this farm at 50% probability was 1.5 tonnes. If the farmer applied extra nitrogen, it's likely to be 2.5 tonnes. Now, this has been the most difficult part of working with farmers and people in general, is talking about probabilities, because people are inherently bad at probabilities. And that's why so many people go to betting shops and poker machines they always think they're going to win. They don't understand that the probabilities behind it. And once we start talking with farmers about the likely outcome and what the probabilities are of achieving a particular yield, then we'll have much more likely success. So for example, on this farm, if you were a farmer or agronomist, the question is, would you invest in more nitrogen to try and get this extra yield? Now, in low rainfall years up here, it's unlikely that that yield increase would pay for the extra nitrogen and the extra time spent on putting that nitrogen out. In a 20% of wet years, you can increase your yield, well, you can double your yield. So it's very advantageous to do. But to make that decision, you need another decision platform, and that is actually knowing where the water is in the profile. So this line here is the crop lower limit, the wilting point in the soil. This is the drained upper limit or the field capacity. This blue area is how much water is in the profile. So that's an output from APSIM. And APSIM is saying that there is 37 millimeters of plant available water. And you can look at the same with the nitrogen status currently is 70 kilograms. And then the next step is, what is the climate or the weather forecast for that particular year likely to be? So we're working closely with our Bureau of Meteorology in developing better tools for farmers to help them. Now, in our region, remember it was down here, in this particular year, we had an 80% chance of getting well above average growing season rainfall from July to September. So that's the period that is critical for our crop production. So based on that evidence, first of all, from the APSIM simulation saying you'll likely get a higher response to nitrogen application, linked to the weather forecast, the farmer put out more nitrogen, you can see him putting it out there, and the actual yield went up from what APSIM predicted without nitrogen, from just over a tonne to the hectare to 2.6, and you can see that the simulated yield and the actual yield were very close. So in this year, it was very successful to use a tool like APSIM developed through the Yield Profit platform to actually help them make that decision. So I think this is my last slide. So we talked about climate risk. The other risks on the farm are price risk. And as you know, the prices change from year to year, and that's something that farmers have to deal with. Australian farmers do not have subsidies, unlike our colleagues and farmers in Europe and in the US. So there's no government support. In total failure years, farmers will get unemployment benefits, but there is no payments for farmers in other sense. New cultivars coming on the market has now been privatised. It used to be run by government. But one thing that I'm passionate about is that delivering a new cultivar and saying, we've got the best whiz-bang silver bullet cultivar for you is never going to work in terms of uptake. It's got to be together with a management package. And generally, higher yielding cultivars need more fertilizer, so there's a nutrition package has to go with it. Quite often, the architecture of the crop is different, which means that the engineering package has to be different because you can't sow them in exactly the same way. And there are many important delivery mechanisms of working with farmers in the delivery of new cultivars. And in Australia, there's been very, very little gain over the last 20 or 30 years with new cultivars in wheat and barley. It's something like 0.75% per year of increase, which is pretty marginal if you look at the investments in new cultivar production. So the future, herbicide resistance is a huge problem because we are very dependent on herbicides. The potential change of long-term effects of climate change haven't been totally worked out for our region yet. Our farms are becoming very large, which means farmers are very isolated, but there are also many positives. There's an increasing demand for grains and wheat. Because farms are reasonably profitable in our area, young farmers are coming home to the farm. We've got very good agronomic information, and IT is really improving in our region, with most farmers now being on the internet and also being able to use all the information technology for seeking new information. So, sorry, am I too long over, Peter? Okay, thank you.
Thanks for excellent presentations. How this modeling exercise is used in the farmer's field. I just want to know one clarification whether you use the uh, farm plan or based on the endowment or the resource available with the farmers, and or only you can provide the simulated yield using this crop models. You work with the farmers to understand the farm plan or the optimal farm plan using the resource available with the farmers, or only with the crop model?
No, sure. So we develop a farm plan together with the farmers before the seeding period, before crops are put into the ground, and we definitely looking at rotation. And that particular farm you saw, its main crops were cereals, but he also grew canola and pulses. Now the pulses obviously the dual benefit for diseases as well as nitrogen, and canola primarily as a disease break. But the planting of those crops is very dependent on how much rainfall we've had prior to seeding, because we know that canola uses more water than wheat and is more susceptible to a dry finish. So we do a lot of farm planning and developing fertiliser budgets as well.
I think he was also referring to how do you set up, not only to run apps, you need to know about the soil, all the efforts going into it.
So in terms of, in relation on how we're using the model, there's been an incredible amount of work over the last 10 years together with CSIRO and by the Grain Research Development Corporation, which is our main funder for agricultural research, in describing the different soils across farms. Now, obviously we can't describe every individual field with the different soil types, but we can build up a picture of what criteria the soils have very quickly if you're working in a particular area. And we can hindcast as well. We can run apps on previous crops that we know the yields for, and then we can adjust the soil criteria to make it fit the best.
Harry?
A very good presentation. One quick comment, you said that only 0.75% yield increase is there. In most of these crops, particularly big cereals like wheat and rice, anywhere you go, yield increase in dryland agriculture is not more than 1%. Genetic gains. So it's not that bad in case of Australia. This is common. And question is, I was seeing your predicted yield when you start using data from 1916, 1926. Suddenly, when you use only the data from 1956, your yield increases to 7.4 tons. So if you go to that slide, and unless I have read it wrong, so how can you explain that? Because less year's data you use, your prediction is less. But in case of the one which was using from 1956 onward, your predicted yield was coming higher.
But the only thing that changes, so in the modelling exercise, and maybe Peter can describe this better, but in the modelling exercise, we're using exactly what's happening in the field up to the day that we run the model. So if we run the model, say 2 months after seeding, when the crop is at growth stage 16 or 6 tillers or just before the end of tillering, then we only forecasting using historical rainfall. So current management, but using 100 years of rainfall from that period, from that day in July to the end of the season. Does that explain your question or not? Yes. Well, maybe
Sure.
Anthony. I mean, I'm sure Anthony can explain it as well.
We'll go Shalana and then Rajiv.
Two quick questions. One is that how, when you delivering this to the farmers, is cost-based or private extension? This is one question. Another one is that when you show the graph, despite the very good method and this approach we are using with FSIM and all, still when you see the relationship between the losses and rainfall, it's very strong. The the Australian farmers is still facing big losses when rainfall is low. So, do you have any evidence when you started using this approach? How much you can reduce the losses for the farmers?
Yeah, so and that's actually an excellent question, because we'll never be able to reduce the losses to zero, because most of the costs in the farming exercise are upfront. And the farmer has to sow his crop, and it's very rare for farmers in Australia to decide not to sow a crop. I've actually only know one farmer who did that in the 25 years that I've worked with farmers in Australia. So they have to sow, and that's a very expensive operation, because you have to buy the seed, the fertilizer, and do the operation. And by the time that the crop is developing, the only thing that we can manipulate are the inputs in terms of nitrogen fertilizer, because we don't use any nitrogen fertilizer at seeding anymore. It's all used in crop. So we can reduce the losses maybe by at the most 10, 15%, but we can never reduce them much more than that, because most of the costs in the farming are actually upfront costs. And I'm not just talking about inputs, I'm also talking about financial costs, living costs, and everything else. So it is a risk management tool, but we can't reduce risk to zero. It's impossible. We can only play around the margins. But one thing that we can do is, in the really good years, we can advise our farmers to increase their profits, which offset the losses, because most farmers will under-fertilise in the good years. And that's what is an opportunity for farmers to make more profits in the good years, which reduces the losses in the bad years.
The first question is about how your profits run.
How it's run? The cost of yield profit. So it's a service. So people pay to use yield profit. Alex, $180 a field. So it's $180 per paddock to run it, but they also have to pay for the actual soil test and the soil analysis. But it's a very, very cheap service. So it's not a profitable exercise for our group to run yield profit, but together with CSIRO, we still see it as a delivery for farmers that is worthwhile. We're not making a loss out of doing it, but we need to grow the business much more. But the problem is this whole probability issue, and people find it very difficult to understand probabilities and how you deal with probabilities and choice.
Okay, Rajiv and then Hemant.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Sam, for very nice presentation. I think you made very clear point that how agronomy and yield profit apps they can help to enhance the. My question is, maybe you might have already done such kind of experiments that, for instance, you do the simulation with the improved varieties and that earlier version of the varieties what farmers are growing, then what kind of increment in the yield you have? Because in my opinion, again, if you see that, so basically better genetics present in the seed is the key, but at the same time, if you are having better agronomy, this is always great. But if you don't have the better genetics in the seed, then just alone agronomy is not going to be helpful. We see these examples, for instance, corn is a success story in the United States, of course, coming from the different private sector, etc. The genetic gain, what they made, this was a result of the several generations of the improved genetic technologies, of course, again, combined with those things. So my question is, if you do those kind of tests, in developing countries, those replacement of varieties takes a lot of time, but in developed countries, this may be after every 5 years, etc. So maybe you can throw some lights on this particular topic.
Sure. So CSIRO actually do update our variety selection, and in Australia we've got a national variety trial network funded by the GRDC, and that data, where the latest varieties, is put back into the APSIM modelling exercise. So we do update with the latest varieties. So something that was developed 20 years ago has obviously got a different yield potential to something that was released 2 or 3 years ago. And that is built into the model through the variety selection. Sorry?
And you see the improvement in the yield in this released or new varieties?
Told him to be honest.
So we can understand the answer. Well, so this is the question that during that,
So
what
Rajit,
time of period or so? Yeah.
So Rajit, one of the problems that I see in Australian agriculture is now the breeding program is now basically privatised. I know that CSIRO is still involved in the pre-breeding, and I think Greg Levetsky was here not so very long ago. But the private sector is essentially driving the release of new varieties. And I'm not always convinced that the release of new varieties is actually profitable, or the adoption of new varieties is profitable for farmers. Australian farmers historically do not buy new seed every year. They use last year's seed, they clean it, they treat the seed, and they plant or they sow last year's seed. And they're not likely to be purchasing new seed every year. They do, not even in canola, and obviously hybrid canola they do, but not in the conventionally developed canola. And the increase in wheat yield over the last 20 or 30 years, the latest varieties are not yielding significantly more than something that is 10 or 15 years old. And that's a problem.
So just yeah, thanks, Sam. It was a nice presentation. Just two quick questions. So, 10 years back when I was living in Australia, I've heard a lot of young farmers going out. So I saw an interesting point, the young farmers coming back. Just want to know what changed. And the second one is just to follow on to what question was already asked. In India, even though the agricultural context is very different, but one of the problems is getting the farmers to pay for services. And how has that changed in Australia? Did it happen over time, or why are the farmers willing to pay for services?
Okay, so there's a few things happened in Australian agriculture for the last 25 years, is that the government departments receive less and less funding, and I'm sure that's happening worldwide, and farmers weren't getting the same service from the departmental agronomists that used to provide the service. So when I first started as a consultant in 1992, there were only 2 private consultants in the whole of the state of Victoria. Now there are hundreds. And because farmers know that they have to pay for good information, and they're running a business. And as you can see in that slide, the size of the business is significant. And quite often their value, the total value, including land, is somewhere around $15 to $20 million for that size farm. So it's a small to medium enterprise, nearly medium-sized enterprise, and they know they have to pay for good information. So that's been a significant change in the last few years. Now, your first question was, sorry. Oh, yes. So that's very interesting, because when I first started consulting, there were very few young farmers coming home to the farm. But because of the farm scale and the amount of technology now on the farm, and I'm sure it's also the availability of communication services through the internet and much better mobile phone service, that people are actually now coming back to the farm. And we've got young women farmers coming back. So, the daughters are actually coming home on the farm, and there's quite a few examples of where young women are running the farm, not necessarily the husbands, but they might be working in the town. And so there's been a dramatic shift in the demographics in our farms. And Alex will know better whether this is Australia-wide, but certainly in our area, it's been a big change.